Hi guys, and welcome to the first of the 10-minute mentor series. This first video is all about the basics of research methods, which is how to operationalise variables and write in a hypothesis. The purpose of this is to get into the real specifics of how to identify when certain hypotheses are appropriate, and to know how to construct a hypothesis for those really tricky scenario-based questions that you get on Research Methods Paper 2. So the first thing to just reiterate is that there's a clear difference between an aim and a hypothesis. The aim is the general purpose of research. That's what you're wanting to find out, okay, what we're trying to investigate. A top tip is when you're looking at scenarios, an aim will typically start with the phrase, the researcher wanted to investigate gender differences in memory, for example, or the researcher wanted to find out about the gender differences in memory. So the key phrases you're looking for there is to find out or to investigate. It's just a brief statement about the purpose. When it comes to writing a hypothesis, however, this is a clear prediction about the outcome of the study. What do you think as a researcher is going to happen? Predicting that relationship between the variables. And when we look particularly at experimental research, we have to have certain things involved within our hypotheses to be able to write them. So the first thing when you're writing a hypothesis that you need to make sure you've picked out in the scenario and that you then include in your hypotheses are the variables. You need to figure out what is the IV and DV between. What is the relationship between in terms of the IV and DV? So the independent variable, that's the thing that we change, that we manipulate, whereas the dependent variable is the thing that we measure. Now, I've put next to it here that we need to operationalise those variables. So they need to be specific and they need to be measurable. You need to put them in a testable format. That means they're unambiguous and two different researchers would kind of interpret those exactly the same. So it's not subjective. So for your independent variable, the thing that we change, one of the easiest ways to operationalise this is to provide a comparison. Okay, what are sometimes nicknamed the two levels of IV. So for example, if I'm looking at gender differences in memory, my independent variable and what is being manipulated is the different gender of my participants. So whether they identify as male, female, non-binary, etc., whatever my different groups are, that's the thing that's changing. The dependent variable, the thing that we measure, the easiest way to operationalise this is to provide a clear unit of measurement. So for example, you need to ask yourself, how am I measuring memory? Is it the score or the number on a test? Is it the amount of items correctly recalled? If you're measuring things such as reaction time, don't forget to say in seconds or in minutes so that it's really specific and measurable. So once you've got your operationalised variables or you've picked them out of the STEM, you need to put them together in a prediction. Remember, because you're predicting something, it's got to be in the future tense. You can't say what has happened or what did happen because it hasn't happened yet. So you've got to write participants will. This is going to happen. So make sure that the language and the tense that you're using when writing a hypothesis is really clear and specific. Okay, you've got that language correct. The last thing I've put on there is once you've got your IV and DV and you've done a prediction, you need to make sure you're using the right sentence starter depending on what type of hypotheses you're writing. Now, there's two main branches of hypotheses that we look at in research. For every time we write a hypothesis, we should always, as a researcher, be able to provide an alternative hypothesis and a null hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is one which suggests there is going to be a significant difference in our variables. The null version says there won't be a difference. The reason that we write a null hypothesis, and I'll come on to this in a later video, is essentially as a backup so that when we're doing our statistical testing, if our hypothesis isn't significant, then we need another one to be able to accept instead. So for every time you write an alternative hypothesis, we have to write a null version of that same hypothesis just in case the results aren't significant. So your sentence starter for your null hypotheses will always be there will be no difference or no relationship between the variables, okay? So by adding that word no, we're suggesting there isn't going to be any sort of change between them. Whereas for an alternative hypothesis, where we're saying there is a significant difference, there's two different types of alternative hypotheses. So we've got directional and non-directional, sometimes nicknamed one-tailed or two-tailed. So your directional hypothesis, which is your one-tailed hypothesis, that is the really specific hypothesis. That is a prediction that we can only write when there has been previous research to indicate the direction. And that's really important to remember. There's no point saying we'll use a directional when there's been research done before, because what if that research was inconclusive or didn't actually tell us anything? So it's only when research has been done that gave us an outcome, that predicted the kind of direction that this could go, that we would use a really specific hypothesis. If we're studying something that's a little bit more vague, so maybe a brand new phenomena that's never been researched or that's quite underdeveloped, or where there's been studies done before but the research didn't come to a conclusion, you would have to use what we call a non-directional or a two-tailed hypothesis, so a much more vague one. Now, in a directional, if you're picking out in a scenario whether or not it's, one or two-tailed, you need to look for certain buzzwords and things in the hypothesis to help you know that it's that. So a directional hypothesis that's specific will use words such as higher, lower, the scores were greater, they increased, decreased. So words that indicate the direction of the change. Whereas in a non-directional, where we're still saying there's a difference, okay, don't get muddled between non-directional and null. Null is separate, that means no difference. Directional and non-directional still say there will be a difference. The only change between that is whether or not it's specific or vague. So for your non-directional, more vague hypotheses, you would say things such as there will be a change in the variables. There will be a difference between these scores. It will alter in some way, but you're just not saying how it's going to be altered or how it's going to be changed. So to help us with that consistency for writing a hypothesis, we've got these key sentence starters that I want you to make sure that you're nailing and using every time you're practicing hypothesis writing. So for a directional, we're going to say participants who. So participants who, for example, are in condition A will do significantly better on the memory test compared to those in condition B. So you're still having to include your operationalised IV and DV, but the difference is in a directional, you're saying which group is going to do better by using that sentence starter, participants who. For a non-directional, we're just going to say there will be a difference. There will be a difference in whatever we're measuring, so in the DV, depending on which condition of the IV they're in. Okay, so again, that's clear sentence starter that you use every time. By nailing these sentence starters and effectively knowing how to operationalise the variables, along with making sure you're doing a future tense and a predicting something, that's all of the ingredients needed to write a specific hypothesis, but also to know when each of them is useful. Now, the last tip that I'll give us about writing a hypothesis is when you're selecting from a STEM whether or not it should be directional or non-directional, sometimes the question is sneaky and it uses the word suitable hypotheses. If you find in an exam question it says write a suitable hypothesis, it's up to you to be able to figure out if it should be directional or not. So in the STEM, you need to look for that phrase, previous research. If it is, then it's directional. If there's no mention of previous research, play it safe and say that it should be non-directional, because we can infer that no research has been done in this area. So hopefully that was a whistle-stop tour of the specifics of writing a hypothesis. Definitely get on some exam practice, practicing out that decoding of a STEM and writing a hypothesis. You can comment down below if you've got any questions, and I'll pop on the Instagram story some different IVs and DVs that you could use to help practice writing your own. So I'll see you in the next video, and thank you for watching.